A leak from Red Bull's 2026 engine has just exposed a game-changing detail, and the entire paddock is now scrambling to respond before the FIA can make a ruling. At the heart of it is a thermal compression trick so powerful, it could hand Red Bull up to 15 horsepower without burning an extra drop of fuel. And here's the problem: the FIA has no precedent to block it. If the system survives inspection, Red Bull walks into 2026 with a weapon no one else can legally copy. But if the FIA bans it in January, they might trigger an engineering collapse Red Bull isn't equipped to handle. Because this isn't Mercedes. This is a first-time engine project. And it's walking the edge of a very sharp cliff. Publicly, everything still looks composed. The FIA has issued no technical directives. There have been no protests, no emergency meetings, no sudden shifts in policy. But the quiet inside the paddock is not calm, it's loaded. The leak of Red Bull's 2026 engine data has not triggered formal accusations, because there's no clear rule being broken. Instead, it's triggered something far more destabilizing: doubt. Doubt in the FIA's readiness. Doubt in the fairness of the new engine regulations. Doubt in whether the technical playing field for 2026 was ever truly level. The leak hasn't exposed a violation, it's exposed the limits of imagination behind the rules. At the center of this storm is Red Bull Powertrains, a division that wasn't supposed to lead the next era. Formed as a contingency after Honda's withdrawal and still in its infancy, the expectation was that Red Bull would focus on reliability, not revolution. Yet what the leak revealed was not an engine designed for safety but for strategic supremacy. The simulations suggest an architecture that bends thermal behavior to its will, squeezing extra torque from stress, manipulating ignition profiles based on real-time heat thresholds, and all without breaching any of the FIA's declared limits. In a sport that punishes ambiguity, Red Bull appears to have built its advantage on exactly that. The 2026 regulations were meant to simplify Formula One's most complex component. By freezing certain technologies and limiting the areas of exploration, the FIA believed it could compress the performance gap and avoid another Mercedes-style domination. But by narrowing the field, they may have created a very specific kind of trap, one that punishes conservative design and rewards risk. Red Bull, as always, took the gamble. And now, the data suggests they may have found the single most exploitable opening in the entire framework: heat management as a secondary performance vector. No one outside Red Bull has the full blueprint, but what's already been extracted from the leak is enough to unnerve even the most confident competitors. Ferrari has initiated internal reviews of its own engine program. Audi has reallocated personnel to assess simulation discrepancies. Honda has requested clarification from the FIA, though not publicly. These aren't accusations. They're alarms. Because the rival teams now suspect that Red Bull's engine doesn't just operate legally, it operates ahead of the rulebook. And the FIA is caught in the worst possible place, without the language to stop it, and without the time to rewrite the rules before homologation begins. Ford's role in this adds another layer of volatility. Their return to F1 through Red Bull was already a major headline. But now, it's becoming a liability for the sport's governance. Because if the first Ford-powered engine in the hybrid era enters with a hidden competitive edge that the FIA can't neutralize, the accusation won't be that Red Bull outsmarted everyone. It'll be that the FIA enabled it. Whether intentional or not, the political fallout could be devastating. Especially if rivals begin the season knowing before the first lights go out that the championship is already out of reach. This is the moment when silence becomes more dangerous than action. Because the longer the FIA refuses to acknowledge the leak, the more the paddock begins to believe that the system is broken. Not corrupt. Not malicious. Just inadequate. And when teams start believing the rulebook can't protect them, they stop innovating. They stop investing. They start lobbying. And that's when Formula One stops being a technological competition and starts becoming a courtroom drama. But the most chilling question still hasn't been answered: is this engine even the final version? Or is it a decoy, an early draft meant to bait the FIA into overreacting, while the real system sits quietly in a simulator somewhere outside Milton Keynes? Because in Red Bull's world, performance is only half the battle. The other half is psychology. And if the FIA moves too late or worse, moves blindly, they might not just lose control of the 2026 championship. They might lose control of the sport itself. The first red flag wasn't a number, it was a trend. When rival engineers reviewed the Red Bull leak, they weren't struck by outrageous power outputs or suspicious spikes. What caught their attention was how the engine responded under stress. In scenarios simulating elevated thermal loads, conditions that typically force other power units to scale back output, Red Bull's model held steady. Then it began to rise. Marginally. Quietly. But consistently. In a simulation that should have shown decay, it showed growth. And in F1, that kind of behavior doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. The leak showed what insiders now call a reactive thermal phase, a mode of engine operation that seems to convert rising heat into usable energy not through traditional energy recovery, but through a subtle shift in combustion timing and pressure wave optimization. Translation: the engine gets stronger as it gets hotter, without violating the fuel flow limits. No spike. No sensor breach. Just an algorithmic shift that slips right past the FIA's current monitoring tools. It's like the system is listening to its own stress and using that stress to extract more power. Ferrari's power unit division ran their own simulations using Red Bull's leaked parameters. What they found shook their confidence. Their engine, conventional by design, couldn't replicate the effect without triggering detonation instability or exceeding pressure tolerances. The Red Bull system wasn't just clever. It was built on a foundation of structural reorientation. You couldn't simply remap your engine to behave like this. You'd have to rebuild your chamber dynamics, modify your cooling curves, and rethink your entire thermal philosophy. In short, if Red Bull's trick works, you either started with it, or you're already too late. What alarmed engineers even more was the absence of traditional indicators. No unusual energy flow data. No suspicious combustion chamber temperatures. Everything looked normal until it didn't. The engine doesn't flip into overdrive. It bends its efficiency curve upward. Slowly. Undetectably. This isn't an overboost. It's a glide into enhanced power. One that lives beneath the thresholds the FIA is designed to monitor. If it weren't for the leak, most teams would have only discovered this behavior when they were already losing time sector by sector with no explanation. Red Bull's use of Ford's hybrid tech also complicates things. There's speculation that the control electronics are integrated in a way that makes real-time ignition and thermal balance adjustments possible without triggering obvious telemetry flags. While not confirmed, the leak suggests the powertrain logic uses a predictive model that anticipates when thermal loads will cross a trigger point, then optimizes combustion phasing in advance. That level of control doesn't just require software. It requires a philosophical shift in how you design the entire power unit ecosystem. Again, something you can't retrofit mid-season. The FIA's current inspection systems rely on baseline performance expectations. They don't look for behaviors that occur only under specific conditions. Red Bull's engine seems to live in that margin. A performance envelope that activates only in long runs, high ambient temperatures, or tight circuits where stress accumulates slowly. That's why the leak is so dangerous. It reveals a hidden second engine buried inside the first one you don't see unless you know exactly when and where to look. And even then, it might be gone before you can prove it existed at all. And there's still the lingering suspicion that this wasn't the full system. The leaked data is incomplete, some values are scrubbed, some simulation IDs missing. If Red Bull wanted to bait rivals into chasing ghosts, this would be the way to do it. Leak just enough to trigger fear and confusion, while the real mechanism remains secure behind closed doors. If that's true, the panic we're seeing now? It's not a reaction to what Red Bull built. It's a reaction to what Red Bull chose to reveal. This is the point where the conversation quietly shifts from engineering to governance. Because once rival teams realized that Red Bull's engine data didn't violate a single explicit rule, the focus stopped being on the trick itself and moved to the rulebook. Or more precisely, to what the rulebook doesn't say. The 2026 regulations are full of limits: fuel flow, electrical output, energy deployment, but they're surprisingly vague when it comes to how combustion is allowed to behave under stress. Red Bull appears to have built an engine that lives entirely inside that vagueness. And that's not illegal. It's just deeply uncomfortable. The FIA now finds itself trapped in a familiar but dangerous position. If they act early and introduce a technical directive aimed at limiting temperature-reactive combustion behavior, they risk being accused of targeting Red Bull specifically. Not because Red Bull broke the rules, but because they understood them better than anyone else. That kind of intervention would immediately trigger political backlash. Team principals would ask why this clarification wasn't part of the original framework. Lawyers would argue about retroactive regulation. And Red Bull would have a strong case that they simply followed the rules as written. In trying to protect fairness, the FIA could end up damaging its own credibility. But if the FIA doesn't act, the consequences may be even worse. Because engine homologation is not a flexible process. Once Red Bull locks in this architecture, it becomes protected, frozen into the regulations for the duration of the cycle. At that point, even if the FIA later decides the concept goes against the spirit of the rules, there's very little they can do without tearing up the entire framework. And Formula One has learned the hard way what happens when one team enters a new era with a power unit advantage no one else can replicate. The championship doesn't just tilt. It collapses. What makes this situation uniquely volatile is timing. This isn't mid-season controversy. This is happening before the cars even exist. Which means the FIA still has theoretical power but no clear justification. There's no race data to point to. No dominance to react against. Just leaked simulations and internal concern. Acting now would be preemptive. Waiting would be reactive. And history suggests the FIA almost always chooses to wait. Red Bull knows that. In fact, their entire strategy seems built around that hesitation. There's also the fear of precedent. If Red Bull's engine is allowed to stand, it sends a message to every team on the grid: the safest path to dominance is not outright innovation, but exploitation of undefined behavior. Future engine concepts won't aim to be clearly legal or clearly illegal. They'll aim to be uncategorizable. That's when regulation stops working. Because you can't police what you can't describe. And the moment teams realize that, the technical arms race doesn't slow down, it becomes more dangerous, more secretive, and far more expensive. Inside the FIA, the concern reportedly isn't just Red Bull. It's what comes next. If this engine philosophy spreads, the governing body could find itself constantly rewriting rules just to keep up. That undermines the entire purpose of long-term regulation cycles. Stability disappears. Trust erodes. And teams stop believing that compliance guarantees fairness. At that point, every innovation becomes a legal gamble, and every season becomes a political negotiation rather than a sporting contest. And yet, despite all this, there's no obvious move for the FIA to make. Any clarification risks escalation. Any silence risks surrender. The governing body is effectively being asked to choose between two bad outcomes: either confront Red Bull before they've done anything wrong, or allow a system that might quietly decide the 2026 championship before the first lights go out. That's the kind of decision that doesn't just define a season. It defines an era. Which is why the most worrying question isn't whether Red Bull's engine is legal. It's whether the FIA still has enough authority and enough foresight to stop the gray areas from becoming the sport itself. Because if they don't act soon, this leak won't be remembered as a warning. It will be remembered as the moment Formula One realized it had already lost control.